They think I'm dying. Let them think it. I'm sitting in my leather armchair, the one Margaret bought me 40 years ago, watching my children through half-closed eyes. They don't know I can see them whispering in the corner of my study, their heads bent together like conspirators in a bad television drama. Richard, my eldest, keeps glancing at me with that practiced look of concern he's perfected over the years. Beside him, Catherine pretends to examine the books on my shelf, but I know she's calculating, always calculating. And there's Michael, my youngest, pacing by the window with his phone clutched in his hand like a lifeline to his precious stock portfolio. They've come for Sunday dinner, as they do every week now. Not out of love, mind you. Out of fear. Fear that I might change my mind. Fear that the fortune I've built over 60 years of blood, sweat, and sacrifice might slip through their grasping fingers. I wasn't always this cynical. There was a time when I looked at my children and saw the future, saw promise, saw the continuation of everything Margaret and I had dreamed of building together. But that was before I understood what they'd become. That was before the incident 6 months ago that opened my eyes to the truth. Let me take you back to that day, the day everything changed. It was a Tuesday in March, unseasonably warm for the time of year. I'd gone to the country club for my usual game of golf with Harold Chin, my attorney and friend of 30 years. We were on the 7th hole when I felt it, a sharp pain in my chest that made me stumble. Harold was beside me in an instant, his face creased with worry, calling for help. I remember the concerned faces of the staff, the sound of the ambulance, the antiseptic smell of the hospital. The doctor said it was a mild heart attack. Nothing too serious, they assured me, but a warning. A reminder that at 78 years old, I wasn't invincible. They kept me for 3 days of observation, and it was during those 3 days that I learned the truth about my children. I was lying in that sterile hospital bed, hooked up to machines that beeped and whirred, when I overheard them. The walls in that place were thin, and they were talking in the hallway just outside my room. They thought I was asleep. "We need to act now," Richard said, his voice low but urgent. "Before he does something stupid." "What do you mean?" That was Catherine, always wanting everything spelled out. "I mean before he decides to leave it all to charity or some ridiculous foundation. You know how sentimental he's gotten lately, always talking about Mom and her causes. The lawyer said Dad's worth at least $12 million. Michael chimed in. Probably more with the real estate appreciation. We can't let that slip away." "So what do we do?" Catherine asked. There was a pause, and then Richard spoke again, his voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "We convince him to sign everything over now. A living trust, power of attorney, the works. We tell him it's for his own protection, that we need to manage things if his health deteriorates further. And if he refuses?" Michael's voice was uncertain. "He won't." Richard sounded confident. "Not if we play this right. We'll make him think it's his idea. We'll talk about preserving his legacy, protecting what he and Mom built. He's sentimental about that stuff. And if that doesn't work, we'll suggest that his judgment might be impaired by the medication. We'll get Dr. Morrison to back us up. I play golf with him every Thursday." The beeping of my heart monitor must have sped up because a nurse came in to check on me. I kept my eyes closed, feigning sleep, but inside I was burning with a rage I'd never felt before. These were my children. The babies Margaret had held in her arms. The toddlers I'd taught to ride bicycles. The teenagers I'd sent to the best universities money could buy. And they were plotting to take everything from me before I was even dead. The nurse adjusted something on the machine and left, and my children continued their conversation, never knowing I'd heard every word. That night, alone in the dark, I made a decision. If they wanted to play games, I would show them what a real strategist could do. I hadn't built a multi-million-dollar business empire by being naive or trusting. I'd done it by being smarter, more cunning, and more patient than everyone else. And I was about to teach my children a lesson they would never forget. The plan formed in my mind over the following weeks. It was beautiful in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. I would give them exactly what they wanted, or at least, make them think I was giving them what they wanted. I would craft a will, a masterpiece of deception, that would have them celebrating their impending inheritance right up until the moment they learned the truth. But I needed help. I couldn't do this alone, and I certainly couldn't use Harold, my regular attorney. Harold was too ethical, too straightforward. He'd asked too many questions, tried to talk me out of it. No, I needed someone else, someone who understood the value of a well-executed deception. I found him through an old business associate, Thomas Blackwell, an attorney who specialized in estate planning and had a reputation for discretion. We met at a small cafe in a town 40 miles from my home, far from prying eyes. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, extending his hand. He was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 50, with sharp eyes and a firm handshake. "I understand you need some creative legal work." I liked him immediately. He didn't waste time with pleasantries or false sympathy. We got down to business over coffee that tasted like battery acid. "I want to create 2 wills," I told him. "One real, one fake. The fake one needs to be convincing enough to fool my children and probably several attorneys for at least a few months after my death." "Can you do that?" Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying me with interest. "That's an unusual request. May I ask why?" I told him everything. The hospital conversation, my children's greed, their plot to seize control of my assets. He listened without interruption, his expression neutral. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled, a small, knowing smile. "I can do better than 2 wills. I can create a scenario where the fake will is discovered first, legally filed, and appears legitimate for months while the real will remains hidden. By the time the truth comes out, it will be too late for them to contest it effectively." "How?" "You'll execute the real will with me as your attorney of record, but we'll keep it sealed and private. I'll file it with a specific probate instruction that it not be opened until 6 months after your death. This is unusual but legal in certain circumstances. Then, we'll create the fake will with your current attorney, making it look like a draft you were working on. We'll leave it somewhere your children will find it after you're gone. They'll rush to probate it, thinking they've won." "And the $3 million? I asked. That was the key to my revenge, the detail I'd planned with malicious glee. "The fake will can state that you're leaving your entire estate, valued at approximately $3 million, to help your children. It will seem oddly worded but not legally suspect. They'll think you've had a change of heart, that you've forgiven them, that you want to take care of them after all." "Perfect." I could barely contain my satisfaction. "And the real will?" "That's where we get creative. Tell me, Mr. Sullivan, what do you really want to do with your estate?" I'd thought about this carefully. Margaret had always supported children's hospitals and educational charities. She'd volunteered every Tuesday at the children's wing of St. Mary's Hospital, reading to the kids, making them smile during their darkest days. After she died 5 years ago from cancer, I'd continued her donations but nothing major. Now I wanted to do something that would make her proud and simultaneously teach my children the most expensive lesson of their lives. "I want to establish the Margaret Sullivan Foundation," I said. $10 million to fund pediatric cancer research and support programs for families dealing with childhood cancer. The remaining $2 million can be split between my housekeeper Rosa, who's been with me for 30 years, and various smaller charities Margaret supported. Thomas made notes on his legal pad. "And your children?" "Nothing. Not a penny. But here's the important part. I want a letter to be read to them when the real will is revealed. A letter explaining exactly why they're getting nothing. That's legally permissible. In fact, it can help prevent them from contesting the will by showing clear intent and sound mind." We spent the next 3 hours working out the details. Thomas was thorough, asking questions I hadn't even considered. How would we handle the difference in estate values? The fake will saying $3 million, the real estate actually worth 12. Simple. The fake will would be dated 6 months earlier, and we'd create documentation suggesting I'd suffered investment losses. My children would believe it because they'd want to believe it. They'd convince themselves that I'd squandered the family fortune on bad investments, that 3 million was all that remained. Over the following month, I worked with Thomas to create both documents. The real will was a straightforward legal document, properly executed and witnessed. The fake will was a work of art, carefully crafted to look legitimate, while containing just enough oddities to make the eventual revelation believable. We made it look like a working draft, with margin notes in my handwriting, comments about wanting to help the children, even though they disappointed me. The hardest part was maintaining the charade with my own children. They'd ramped up their campaign after my hospital stay, visiting more frequently, bringing their families, acting like the devoted children they'd never been. Richard would sit beside me and talk about family legacy, about how important it was to keep the Sullivan name strong. Catherine would bring photo albums and remind me of holidays past, of times when we'd supposedly been happy. Michael would update me on his investment strategies, not so subtly suggesting that I let him manage my portfolio. I played along. I let them think their strategy was working. I started making comments about my mortality, about wanting to ensure they were taken care of. I mentioned speaking to Harold about my will, watching their eyes light up with poorly concealed eagerness. "Don't wait too long, Dad," Richard said during one visit, his hand on my shoulder in a gesture that might have seemed affectionate to anyone who didn't know the truth. "These things take time to set up properly. You want to make sure everything is in order." "I know, son," I replied, infusing my voice with just the right amount of elderly uncertainty. "I've been thinking about it a lot. You're right. I should take care of these things while I still can." The smile on his face was triumphant. He thought he'd won. For months after my hospital stay, I set the final stage of my plan in motion. I called a family meeting at my house on a Sunday afternoon. All 3 of my children came, their spouses in tow, their faces masks of concern and anticipation. We gathered in my study, the same room where I'd overheard their plotting through the security camera system they didn't know I'd installed. Oh yes, I'd installed cameras throughout the house after the hospital incident. I wanted evidence of their behavior, their true selves when they thought I wasn't watching. The footage I'd collected over the months was damning. Richard going through my desk when he thought I was napping. Catherine photographing documents in my filing cabinet. Michael having phone conversations with a lawyer about conservatorship options. All of it saved, all of it catalogued, all of it to be included with my real will as evidence of their unworthiness. But on this Sunday, I played the role of the elderly patriarch, confused and concerned about the future. "I've asked you all here because I've made a decision," I began, my voice deliberately trembling. "About my estate." The room went silent. 6 pairs of eyes locked on me with an intensity that would have been frightening if I hadn't been prepared for it. "I've been thinking about your mother a lot lately," I continued, reaching for the framed photo of Margaret on my desk. "About what she would want. About family, about taking care of the people you love." "That's good, Dad," Catherine said softly. "Mom would want you to be at peace." Peace. The word almost made me laugh. There would be no peace for them, not when they learned the truth. But I kept my face composed, sad, resigned. "I've decided to revise my will. Harold is helping me with the paperwork. Everything will be in order soon." "What have you decided, Dad?" Richard leaned forward, unable to hide his eagerness. "I want to take care of you," I said simply. "All of you. That's what a father does. That's what your mother would want." The relief in the room was palpable. They thought they'd won. They thought their manipulation had worked. Richard and Catherine exchanged a glance. Michael actually smiled, something I hadn't seen him do in years when he looked at me. "That's wonderful, Dad," Richard said. "We'll make sure your legacy continues. Everything you and Mom built will be preserved." Preserved. Perverted was more like it. But I nodded and smiled and played the part of the grateful father surrounded by loving children. The weeks that followed were almost amusing. My children's behavior shifted noticeably. They were nicer to me, more patient, more present. Catherine started calling me every day. Michael invited me to his daughter's soccer games. Richard took me to lunch at the country club and introduced me to his colleagues as the man who taught me everything I know about business. It was all an act, of course. I knew it, and they knew I knew it, but we all pretended otherwise. It was like watching a play where everyone knew the script was terrible but nobody wanted to be the first to walk off stage. During this time, I finalized both wills with surgical precision. The real will was locked in Thomas Blackwell's safe, along with USB drives containing all the security camera footage of my children's behavior, detailed financial records showing the true value of my estate, and a letter I'd written explaining my decision. The fake will was completed with Harold, who knew nothing of my true plans. I made sure it contained just enough detail to be believable, the estate valued at approximately $3 million, to be divided among my children, to help them, as I'd always wanted to do. Harold thought it was a straightforward, if somewhat sentimental, document. He had no reason to question it. Then came the most delicate part of my plan, making sure my children would find the fake will first. I needed it to be discovered naturally, not planted so obviously that they'd become suspicious. I accomplished this through my housekeeper, Rosa. She was the only person in the world I still trusted completely. Rosa had been with me since Michael was born. She'd helped Margaret through her illness, held my hand at the funeral, and kept my house running even when I'd been too grief-stricken to care. She knew my children for what they were because she'd watched them transform from innocent kids into greedy adults. I told her everything. Every detail of my plan. And when I finished, she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "Mrs. Margaret would be proud of you." That meant more to me than anything. Rosa's role was simple but crucial. After I died, she would discover the fake will in my desk drawer while sorting through my papers. She would immediately call my children, emotional and distraught, and tell them she'd found my last will and testament. They would rush over, claim the document, and begin the probate process, never suspecting that the real will was sitting in Thomas Blackwell's office, sealed and waiting. Everything was in place. All I had to do was die. I should clarify, I wasn't actually dying. Despite the heart attack, my doctors had given me a clean bill of health. With proper medication and lifestyle changes, they said I could easily live another 10 or 15 years. But my children didn't need to know that. I began a campaign of carefully orchestrated decline. Nothing too dramatic, nothing that would require hospitalization or medical intervention, just a gradual dimming of vitality. I started moving more slowly, forgetting small details and conversations, seeming more tired. I hired a nurse to come by twice a week, not because I needed one but because it would reinforce the image of deteriorating health. My children noticed, of course. They started visiting even more frequently, their concern now tinged with anticipation. They were waiting for the end, preparing themselves for the inheritance they believed was coming. I watched them with a strange mix of sadness and satisfaction. These were my children, my own flesh and blood, and they were counting down the days until I died. Margaret would have been heartbroken. But Margaret had always seen the best in people, even when the best wasn't there. She'd loved our children unconditionally, believed in them even when they disappointed her. I'd loved them too, once. Now, I felt nothing but contempt and a burning desire to teach them a lesson. The months passed. Fall turned to winter. I celebrated my 79th birthday with a small party that my children organized, and I watched them toast to many more years, while their eyes calculated how much longer they'd have to wait. Then, on a cold evening in February, I had Rosa call them all and tell them I'd been taken to the hospital. "Another heart episode," she said, her voice breaking convincingly. This time it looked serious. They came immediately, filling the hospital waiting room with their presence and their pretense of grief. I watched them through slightly open eyes as they comforted each other, as Catherine cried into Richard's shoulder, as Michael stood by the window looking stoic and strong. The doctors, who I'd briefed on my plan, played along perfectly. They spoke in serious tones about heart failure, about quality of life, about making me comfortable. They suggested I might want to go home, to spend my final days in familiar surroundings. My children agreed immediately. They wanted me home where they could control the situation, where they could ensure nothing went wrong with their plans. Rosa took me home the next day. The house had never felt more empty, more cold, despite the fire burning in the study fireplace. My children took turns staying with me, sitting by my bedside, holding my hand, speaking in soft voices about memories and love and family. It was all lies, and we all knew it. A week later, on a Tuesday evening in February, I decided it was time to execute the final phase of my plan. I'd had enough of the charade, enough of watching my children pretend to care. I wanted to move forward, to see the look on their faces when they learned the truth. But I had a problem. I wasn't actually dying, and I needed them to believe I had died. This is where Thomas Blackwell earned every penny I was paying him. He'd come up with an elegant solution, something so audacious that I'd initially thought it was impossible. But Thomas had connections, resources, and a creative mind that matched my own. The plan was this: I would fake my own death, let my children go through the process of discovering the fake will, filing it for probate, and celebrating their inheritance. I would watch from a distance as they learned the estate was worth only $3 million instead of the $12 million they'd expected. I would see their disappointment, their attempts to find hidden assets, their gradual acceptance that this was all they were getting. And then, after 6 months, when they'd spent the money, made their plans, and moved on with their lives, the real will would be revealed. Thomas would emerge with the properly executed document, the foundation would be established, and my children would learn that not only were they getting nothing, but that I'd been alive all along, watching their greed play out in real time. It was risky. It required perfect timing and execution. It meant disappearing from my own life for months, living in hiding while the world thought I was dead. But the more I thought about it, the more perfect it seemed. Thomas handled the logistics. He owned a small property in Montana, a cabin in the middle of nowhere that would serve as my hideout. Rosa would come with me, of course. I couldn't do this without her. We'd live there quietly for 6 months while my children played out their roles in the drama I'd created. The death was staged for a Wednesday morning in March, exactly 1 year after my first heart attack. Rosa found me, unresponsive, in my bed and called 911. The paramedics who arrived were actually associates of Thomas, men he'd worked with on other sensitive matters. They pronounced me dead at the scene, loaded my body into the ambulance, and drove away while Rosa called my children with the devastating news. I wasn't in the ambulance, of course. I was already on my way to Montana with Thomas, driving through the early morning darkness while my children rushed to my house to begin their inheritance proceedings. The death certificate was a forgery, good enough to fool anyone who didn't look too closely. The cremation was staged, with Rosa receiving an urn full of ashes that weren't mine. The funeral was planned for the following week, giving my children time to grieve and, more importantly, time to find the fake will. Everything went exactly as planned. Rosa called me that evening from a burner phone with an update. "They found the will," she said, her voice a mixture of triumph and disgust. "Mr. Richard went straight to your desk. He didn't even pretend to wait. They're with Mr. Harold now, filing it for probate." "And their reaction to the $3 million?" I asked, unable to keep the satisfaction from my voice. "Oh, Mr. Sullivan, you should have seen their faces. Like someone had slapped them. Mr. Richard kept asking if there were other assets, other accounts. Mr. Michael looked like he was going to be sick. And Mrs. Catherine just kept saying, "Only $3 million? That's all?" I smiled in the darkness of the Montana cabin. It was beginning. The funeral was strange to watch. Thomas had set up a secure video feed so I could observe the service from Montana. I sat in the cabin living room, Rosa beside me, and watched as 300 people gathered to say goodbye to a man who wasn't dead. My children played their parts beautifully. Richard gave a eulogy about family legacy and business success. Catherine shared memories of childhood, her voice breaking at carefully orchestrated moments. Michael read a poem about fathers and sons that he'd clearly found on the internet that morning. The whole thing was a performance, and I was the only audience member who knew the truth. In the weeks that followed, I monitored their activities through various means. Thomas had associates keeping tabs on the probate process, on my children's meetings with Harold, on their increasingly desperate attempts to locate additional assets. I watched through security cameras still active in my house as they went through my belongings, searching for hidden bank accounts or undisclosed investments. The most revealing moment came 3 weeks after my death. Richard, Catherine, and Michael met in my study late at night. They thought they were alone, but the cameras were always watching. $3 million, Richard said, pacing in front of my desk. Split 3 ways, that's only $1 million each. After taxes, we're talking about maybe $600,000. That's still a lot of money, Michael offered weakly. It's nothing, Richard exploded. Dad was worth at least $12 million. We all knew it. Where did the rest go? Bad investments? Catherine suggested. Maybe he lost it before he died. Or maybe he hid it. Richard turned to his siblings, his expression dark. Maybe he knew what we were planning. Maybe he moved the assets somewhere we can't find them. How would he know? Michael asked. I don't know, but I intend to find out. I'm hiring a forensic accountant. We'll track every dollar Dad had for the last 5 years. If there's money hidden somewhere, we'll find it. I watched this with grim satisfaction. They were exactly as I'd predicted, greedy, suspicious, and completely self-absorbed. They weren't grieving for their father. They were mourning the money they thought they'd lost. Over the next 2 months, Richard spent thousands of dollars on investigators and accountants, all trying to locate assets that didn't exist. The reports that came back were consistent. I'd suffered significant investment losses over the past year, and the $3 million in the will represented the entirety of my remaining estate. It was a masterful deception. Thomas had created a paper trail of bad investments and market losses, all documented and legitimate looking. The money hadn't actually been lost, of course. It was safely hidden in accounts my children would never find. But on paper, their father had been a foolish old man who'd gambled away his fortune in the stock market. Finally, after 8 weeks of investigation, Richard accepted defeat. The money was gone. $3 million was all there was. I watched through the cameras as they met one final time in my study. We take what we can get, Richard said, his voice bitter. $1 million each. It's better than nothing. What about the foundation Mom wanted? Catherine asked. Dad always said he'd do something for pediatric cancer research. Richard's laugh was harsh. With what money? We're taking our inheritance, Catherine. If Dad had wanted to give to charity, he should have left more. And there it was. The final confirmation of everything I'd believed about them. They weren't even going to honor their mother's memory. They were going to take the money and run, grateful for whatever scraps they could get from their father's estate. The probate process moved forward. Harold distributed the assets according to the fake will. Each of my children received their portion, $1 million each, minus taxes and fees. I watched as the checks were cut, as they signed the final documents, as they walked out of Harold's office with their inheritance. They thought it was over. They thought they'd won, even if the prize was smaller than they'd hoped. But the real game was just beginning. 6 months after my death, Thomas Blackwell made his move. He filed a motion with the probate court, presenting my real will along with a declaration that he'd been my attorney of record for estate planning. The filing included the sealed documents I'd left with him, the security camera footage of my children's behavior, and a letter explaining that I'd had reasons to believe my previously filed will might be compromised. The letter also included a small detail that Thomas had suggested, something so perfect I'd immediately agreed, a provision stating that I had deliberately created a test for my children, wanting to see how they would behave after my death. The $3 million will had been part of that test, and they had failed spectacularly. The probate court was required to notify all interested parties, which meant Harold had to inform my children that a new will had been filed contesting the one they'd already received payment from. I wish I could have seen their faces when they got that call. Thomas recorded the court hearing where the real will was presented. All 3 of my children were there, along with their attorneys. Harold was there too, looking confused and concerned. The judge presiding over the case was a woman named Margaret Chin, which I took as a sign from the universe that I was doing the right thing. Thomas presented the case methodically. He showed that the real will had been executed before the fake one, that I'd been of sound mind, that all legal requirements had been met. He played excerpts from the security camera footage showing my children searching through my belongings after my death. He read my letter aloud, explaining my reasons for disinheriting them. The courtroom was silent as my words echoed through the space. I leave nothing to my children Richard, Catherine, and Michael Sullivan because they have demonstrated through their actions that they value my money more than they value me. They plotted to take control of my assets before I died. They celebrated my death as a path to wealth rather than mourning the loss of their father. They failed the test of basic human decency, and for that, they deserve nothing. Richard's attorney tried to argue that the will was invalid, that I'd been coerced or mentally incompetent. But Thomas had anticipated this. He presented medical records showing I'd been in perfect mental health when the real will was executed. He had testimony from the witnesses who'd been present at the signing. He had documentation of every step of the legal process. The judge took 2 weeks to review everything. When she issued her ruling, it was swift and decisive. The real will was valid, the fake will had been a test, and my children were required to return the money they'd received, with interest. There was just one more detail in the ruling, something that would come as a shock to everyone in that courtroom. Judge Chen looked directly at my children and said, I'm also compelled to note that Mr. Sullivan's death certificate has been called into question by the evidence presented. The court is ordering an investigation into whether Mr. Sullivan is, in fact, deceased. That's when I made my entrance. I'd flown back from Montana the night before, timing my return perfectly. I'd let my beard grow during my 6 months in hiding, and I'd lost weight, but I was unmistakably alive. Rosa was with me, and so was Thomas, looking pleased with himself. We walked into the courtroom just as the judge finished speaking. The gasps were audible. Richard went pale. Catherine actually screamed. Michael looked like he might faint. Good afternoon, Your Honor, I said, my voice strong and clear. I apologize for the confusion regarding my death. As you can see, the reports were greatly exaggerated. The courtroom erupted in chaos. The judge had to bang her gavel repeatedly to restore order. Richard's attorney was on his feet, shouting about fraud. Catherine was crying. Michael just sat there, staring at me like I was a ghost. Judge Chin, to her credit, maintained her composure. Mr. Sullivan, this court would very much like an explanation. I spent the next hour providing one. I explained the hospital conversation I'd overheard, my children's plot to take control of my assets, and my decision to teach them a lesson. I explained the fake death, the 6 months in hiding, and the careful orchestration of events that had led to this moment. I wanted my children to understand what they'd become, I said. I wanted them to see their own greed reflected back at them. I wanted them to know what it feels like to be betrayed by the people you love. The judge listened without interruption. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Mr. Sullivan, she finally said, what you've done is highly irregular and potentially illegal. You've defrauded the probate system, filed false documents, and caused considerable distress to many people. I understand, Your Honor, I replied, and I'm prepared to face any consequences. She studied me carefully. However, given the evidence you've presented of your children's behavior, and given that the real will was properly executed and legally sound, I'm inclined to validate it. The fake will and all distributions made under it are hereby nullified. Your children will be required to return the funds they received, with interest. The estate will be distributed according to your true wishes. She paused, then added, as for the matter of the fake death certificate and the other irregularities, I'm referring this case to the district attorney. They'll decide whether charges are warranted. Court is adjourned. I turned to face my children as the courtroom cleared. They sat frozen in their seats, their attorneys whispering urgently in their ears. But I could see the truth in their eyes. They knew they'd lost. More than that, they knew they'd been beaten at their own game. Richard was the first to approach me. His face was red with rage, his hands clenched into fists. "How could you?" he demanded. "We're your children! And you're greedy strangers," I replied calmly. "I gave you everything growing up. The best schools, the best opportunities, every advantage money could buy. And you repaid me by plotting to steal from me before I was even dead." "We weren't stealing," Catherine said, her voice shaking. "We just wanted what was rightfully ours." "Nothing was rightfully yours," I said. "I earned that money. Your mother and I built that fortune through decades of hard work. You didn't contribute anything. You just waited around for us to die so you could cash in." Michael stood up, his face pale. "So what now? You're just going to cut us off completely?" "That's exactly what I'm going to do," I confirmed. "Every penny of my estate is going to the Margaret Sullivan Foundation. It's going to help children with cancer, which is more than you three would ever do with it." "You're a cruel old man," Richard said. I smiled. "No, son. I'm a man who finally opened his eyes to the truth. And the truth is, you're not worth my money or my love. You proved that yourselves." I turned and walked out of the courtroom, Rosa and Thomas beside me. Behind me, I could hear my children's voices rising in argument, in accusation, in despair. But I didn't look back. That chapter of my life was over. The aftermath was messy but satisfying. The district attorney decided not to press charges against me, ruling that while my actions had been unorthodox, they hadn't technically violated any laws. The fake death certificate had been filed by Thomas's associates, not by me, and they'd already left the country. The money my children had received was returned within 60 days, along with interest and penalties. The Margaret Sullivan Foundation was established with $10 million as planned. Rosa received her $2 million, which she tried to refuse until I insisted. The remaining funds were distributed to various charities my wife had supported. My children tried to contest the will again, of course. They hired expensive attorneys and argued every point they could think of. But the evidence was overwhelming, and eventually they gave up. Richard stopped speaking to me entirely. Catherine sent a few angry emails before blocking my number. Michael tried once to reconcile, to explain that he'd been influenced by his older siblings, but I could see the lie in his eyes. I never spoke to any of them again. People often ask me if I have any regrets about what I did. They ask if I wish I'd tried to repair the relationships, tried to understand my children's perspective, tried to be more forgiving. And my answer is always the same: no. I don't regret teaching my children a lesson they desperately needed to learn. I don't regret protecting the fortune I built with my wife's help. And I don't regret establishing a foundation that will help thousands of children for generations to come. What I do regret is that I didn't see the truth about my children sooner. I regret the years I spent making excuses for them, believing they would change, hoping they would become the people Margaret and I had raised them to be. I regret that it took a heart attack and a hospital conversation to open my eyes. But once they were open, I saw clearly. And what I saw was that sometimes, the people who should love you the most are the ones who disappoint you the most profoundly. And when that happens, you have two choices. You can pretend everything is fine and let them continue to take advantage of you, or you can stand up and show them that actions have consequences. I chose the latter. And I'd make the same choice again. It's been 3 years since the courtroom revelation. 3 years since I came back from the dead and reclaimed my life. 3 years since I last spoke to any of my children. I'm 82 years old now, and my health is actually better than it was before my death. Turns out, removing toxic people from your life, even when they're family, has remarkable health benefits. Who knew? I live in a smaller house now, a comfortable place near the ocean that reminds me of the vacations Margaret and I used to take. Rosa lives in the guest house on the property, and we've settled into a comfortable routine. She gardens, I read, and we have dinner together every evening, talking about everything and nothing. The Margaret Sullivan Foundation has exceeded every expectation. In 3 years, we've funded 12 major research projects into pediatric cancer treatment. We've provided support to over 500 families dealing with childhood cancer. We've established 3 scholarship programs for medical students focusing on pediatric oncology. The Foundation's annual gala is now one of the most prestigious charitable events in the state. I attend every event, every fundraiser, every ribbon-cutting ceremony. I shake hands with researchers who are doing the work Margaret always dreamed would be done. I meet children who are alive because of treatments the Foundation helped develop. I talk to parents who cry when they thank me for the support that helped them through the darkest time of their lives. This is what wealth should be used for. This is what legacy really means. My children, meanwhile, have not fared as well. I don't actively keep tabs on them, but information has a way of finding its way back to me. Richard's business ventures have struggled without the influx of capital he was expecting from my estate. He had to sell his beach house and downsize significantly. His wife left him last year, citing his increasing bitterness and anger as the reason. He drinks more than he should and has aged badly. Catherine's marriage is hanging by a thread. Her husband, who'd been counting on that inheritance to cover some bad investments, blames her for the loss. They're fighting constantly, and their children have started acting out. Catherine tried to reach out to me once, through a mutual acquaintance, asking if we could meet. I declined. Some bridges, once burned, should stay that way. Michael has fared slightly better, but only slightly. He still has his job, but the lifestyle he'd been living while expecting a 7-figure inheritance proved difficult to maintain on his actual salary. He had to pull his children out of private school. He sold the boat he'd purchased on credit. His social circle has contracted significantly now that he can't afford to keep up with the country club set. I feel no sympathy for any of them. They made their choices. They showed me who they really were. And now they're living with the consequences of their greed and their betrayal. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the children they used to be. Richard at age 7, so proud when he hit his first baseball. Catherine at 10, bringing me flowers she'd picked from the garden. Michael at 5, falling asleep on my lap while I read him stories. Those children are gone, if they ever really existed. Perhaps I'd been seeing what I wanted to see all along, investing them with qualities they never possessed. Perhaps Margaret and I had spoiled them too much, given them too much too easily, and created the monsters they became. Or perhaps some people are just fundamentally selfish, and no amount of good parenting can change that. I'll never know the answer, and I've made peace with that uncertainty. There have been other consequences to my actions, some unexpected. The story of my revenge became national news. "Man fakes death to expose greedy children," was the headline that appeared in newspapers across the country. I gave exactly one interview, to a respected journalist who promised to tell the story fairly. The article went viral. Millions of people read it, commented on it, shared it. The response was split almost evenly down the middle. Half the people praised me for standing up to my children, for teaching them a lesson, for using my wealth responsibly. The other half condemned me as cruel, vindictive, and unforgiving. I received thousands of letters. Some were supportive, from people who'd experienced similar betrayals from their own families. Others were hateful, accusing me of being a terrible father who'd driven his children to desperation. I read them all, every single one, but they didn't change my mind about anything. The most interesting letters came from estate attorneys and financial planners. Apparently, my case has become something of a cautionary tale in their profession. They use it to teach clients about the importance of clear communication with family about inheritance, about the dangers of entitlement, and about the legal complexities of estate planning. Some have even started calling it the Sullivan strategy, which makes me laugh every time I hear it. I didn't invent family dysfunction or creative estate planning, I just executed it better than most. There have been legal ramifications as well. Several states have introduced legislation to prevent the kind of elaborate deception I pulled off. They're calling them anti-fraud estate planning laws. And they're designed to make it harder for people to fake their deaths or file misleading probate documents. I'm oddly proud of this. I've changed the legal landscape in a small but measurable way. Future generations of scheming patriarchs and matriarchs will have to work harder to pull off what I did. Thomas Blackwell, my co-conspirator, has become something of a celebrity in legal circles. He's written a book about the ethics of aggressive estate planning, using my case as the central example. We still have lunch once a month, and he's become one of my closest friends. He's also on the board of the Margaret Sullivan Foundation, where his sharp mind and creative thinking have proven invaluable. Rosa, dear Rosa, has thrived in our new life. She's become involved with the foundation as well, organizing volunteer programs and support groups for families. She tells me often that she's prouder of me now than she ever was during my business career. Coming from her, that means everything. I've also developed unexpected friendships with some of the families the foundation has helped. There's a couple, Maria and James, whose daughter Lily was diagnosed with leukemia at age 6. The foundation's family support program helped them through the worst of it, providing financial assistance, counseling, and practical support. Lily is 10 now and in remission, and I attend her birthday parties every year. She calls me Grandpa Frank, and it makes me happier than I ever thought possible. There's an 8-year-old boy named Daniel whose parents couldn't afford the experimental treatment that might save his life. The foundation covered it. Daniel drew me a picture of a superhero, which I have framed in my study. He told me I was his real-life superhero because I helped him beat the bad guys in his blood. These children, these families, they're my legacy now. Not Richard, Catherine, or Michael. Not the business I built, or the money I made. These lives I've touched, these futures I've helped secure, this is what matters. Of course, I know what people think. They think I'm a bitter old man who couldn't forgive his children for being human. They think I should have tried harder to understand their perspective, to see that maybe they were just worried about their own family's futures. They think I should have been more generous, more forgiving, more willing to overlook their flaws. But here's what those people don't understand. I didn't punish my children for being imperfect. I punished them for being cruel. There's a difference between making a mistake and plotting someone's downfall. There's a difference between worrying about your future and celebrating your father's death. There's a difference between wanting security and viewing your parent as nothing more than a walking bank account. My children crossed lines that should never be crossed. They did it knowingly, deliberately, and without remorse. And when given the chance to show their true character after my death, they proved that every suspicion I'd had about them was correct. They didn't mourn me. They mourned the money they thought they'd lost. They didn't honor their mother's memory. They dismissed her causes as inconvenient obstacles to their inheritance. They didn't feel gratitude for the life I'd given them. They felt entitled to more. So no, I don't feel guilty about what I did. I feel liberated. For years, I'd been carrying the weight of their expectations, their demands, their unspoken accusations that I owed them something simply because I'd brought them into the world. I'd been funding their lifestyles, bailing them out of bad decisions, and pretending that we had a relationship based on love rather than money. The fake death freed me from all of that. It allowed me to see them clearly, without the fog of parental obligation clouding my judgment. And what I saw was enough to convince me that I'd made the right decision. I've started writing this all down, not for publication but for posterity. When I do eventually die for real this time, I want there to be a complete record of what happened and why. I want future generations to understand that this wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about justice. It was about holding people accountable for their actions. It was about ensuring that wealth built through hard work and sacrifice went to causes that mattered rather than to people who would squander it. The real will, the one that matters, is simple and straightforward now. Everything to the foundation. A comfortable pension for Rosa. And a provision that if any of my children try to contest it, they'll be required to donate $100,000 to the foundation for every legal action they take. Thomas assures me it's ironclad. After everything that happened the first time, we've made sure there are no loopholes, no technicalities, no way for them to claw back what they've lost. I've also left behind all the security camera footage, all the documentation of their behavior, all the evidence I collected of their plotting and scheming. Not to punish them further, but to ensure that the truth is preserved. Someday, perhaps, their own children will see it and learn from their parents' mistakes. Because that's what this is really about, lessons. The lesson that character matters more than wealth. The lesson that family loyalty has to be earned, not assumed. The lesson that you can't manipulate people forever without consequences. I learned these lessons late in life, but I learned them thoroughly. And through my actions I've taught them to my children, whether they wanted to learn them or not. Today is a beautiful day. The sun is shining, the ocean is calm, and I'm sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee and the newspaper. Rosa is in the garden, humming to herself as she tends her roses. In an hour, I have a video call with the Foundation's research director to discuss a promising new treatment protocol. This evening, I'm having dinner with Maria, James, and Lily to celebrate Lily's latest clean scan. This is my life now. Simple, meaningful, and free of toxicity. People sometimes ask me if I ever wish things had been different with my children. They ask if I regret not having them in my life, not knowing my grandchildren, not having that traditional family structure as I age. The answer is no. I don't miss them at all. What I miss is the idea of them, the fantasy I'd constructed of who they were supposed to be. But I don't miss the reality of who they actually are. I don't miss the tension of their visits, the veiled demands for money, the fake affection covering real resentment. I'm happier now than I've been in years. Maybe happier than I've ever been since Margaret died. And that happiness is worth more than any amount of money, any family connection, any societal expectation of what an elderly father should feel toward his children. I choose happiness over obligation. I choose purpose over pretense. I choose the family I've built, the one based on genuine affection and shared values, over the family I was born into. And I'd make that choice every single day for the rest of my life. Last week, something unexpected happened. I received a letter from my grandson, Richard's oldest son, Thomas Jr. He's 23 now, graduated from college last year. I hadn't heard from him since the courtroom revelation. The letter was thoughtful, well-written, and brutally honest. He said he'd spent the last 3 years trying to understand what had happened between his father and me. He'd read every article, watched every interview, reviewed every court document. And he'd come to a conclusion: his father had been wrong. "I'm ashamed of how my father behaved," he wrote. "I'm ashamed that I didn't see it happening. I'm ashamed that I benefited from his expectations of your money without questioning whether it was right." He went on to say that he'd been working with a therapist to process his family's dysfunction, that he'd distanced himself from his father's bitterness, and that he was trying to build a life based on his own values rather than inherited entitlement. "I'm not writing to ask for money," the letter concluded. "I have a job, I'm supporting myself, and I'm learning what it means to earn things rather than expect them. I'm writing to tell you that I understand why you did what you did. And to thank you for showing me what happens when people lose sight of what really matters. I hope someday, if you're willing, we might be able to meet for coffee." Not as grandfather and grandson with all that baggage, but as two people trying to figure out how to live with integrity. But if you're not interested, I understand that too. I held that letter for a long time, reading and rereading it. Rosa found me on the porch, tears streaming down my face. "Good news or bad news?" she asked gently. "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. "I've been thinking about that letter every day since it arrived. Part of me wants to reach out, to meet with Thomas Jr. to see if he's genuine or if this is another manipulation. Part of me wants to protect myself, to maintain the boundaries I've so carefully established, to avoid the risk of being hurt again. I haven't decided what to do yet. Maybe I'll respond, maybe I won't. Maybe I'll meet with him, maybe I'll keep my distance. For now, the letter sits on my desk, a reminder that even in the aftermath of destruction, new growth is sometimes possible. But whatever I decide, it will be on my terms. I'm done letting other people's expectations dictate my choices. I'm done sacrificing my peace of mind for the sake of family obligations that were never reciprocated. If Thomas Jr. wants a relationship with me, it will have to be one built on honesty, respect, and genuine affection. Nothing less will do. I've learned that lesson too well to compromise on it now. Margaret once told me something I didn't fully understand at the time. We were in our 50s, successful but not yet wealthy, and we were discussing what kind of legacy we wanted to leave. "I don't want to be remembered for how much money we made," she said. "I want to be remembered for how much good we did with it." At the time, I nodded and agreed, but I didn't really get it. I was still caught up in the game of business, in the thrill of making deals and building wealth. The money itself seemed like the goal, like the measure of success. It took losing Margaret, and then almost losing everything to my children's greed, for me to understand what she meant. Money is just a tool. It has no inherent meaning or value beyond what we choose to do with it. You can use it to build things or destroy them. You can use it to help people or hurt them. You can use it to create a legacy of compassion or a legacy of corruption. I chose compassion. Not because I'm a saint, not because I'm particularly virtuous, but because Margaret showed me what that looked like. She showed me that true wealth isn't measured in dollars but in the lives you touch, the people you help, the positive changes you make in the world. The Margaret Sullivan Foundation isn't just a charitable organization. It's a living testament to the kind of person she was and the kind of person she helped me become. Every child we help, every family we support, every breakthrough we fund, it's all a reflection of her values and her vision. My children wanted money. I gave the world something better. I gave them Margaret's legacy, her compassion, her unwavering belief that we're all responsible for taking care of each other. And in doing so, I finally became the man she always believed I could be. I'm writing this on what would have been Margaret's 81st birthday. Every year on this day, I visit her grave with fresh roses and spend an hour telling her about everything that's happened since I last visited. Today, I told her about the Foundation's latest achievements, about Lily's clean scan, about Daniel's progress. I told her about Rose's garden and Thomas Blackwell's book. I told her about the letter from Thomas Jr. and my uncertainty about how to respond. And I told her about our children. "I don't think you'd be happy with what I did," I admitted, running my fingers over her headstone. "You always believed in giving people second chances, third chances, infinite chances. You loved them unconditionally, even when they disappointed you." The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, I could almost hear her voice. "But I think you'd understand why I did it. You knew what they were becoming. You saw it before I did. You just loved them too much to give up on them." I sat there in silence for a while, remembering the good times, the times before everything fell apart. Remembering the children they'd been before greed and entitlement corrupted them. Remembering the life Margaret and I had built together, brick by brick, dream by dream. "I miss you," I said finally. "Every single day. But I'm doing okay. I'm living the life we talked about, the one where we make a difference. I just wish you were here to see it." As I stood to leave, I placed the roses on her grave and made a decision. I'm going to respond to Thomas Jr.'s letter. I'm going to meet with him, carefully and cautiously, but I'm going to give him a chance. Not because I owe him anything, not because I'm obligated to, but because Margaret would want me to. Because sometimes, just sometimes, people can change. And because closing every door means living in darkness, and I've spent enough time in the dark. I'll protect myself, of course. I'll maintain my boundaries. I'll watch for signs of manipulation or ulterior motives. But I'll also keep an open mind and an open heart, because that's what Margaret would do. And maybe, just maybe, there's a possibility for redemption after all. Not for Richard, Catherine, or Michael. They made their choices and showed their true colors too clearly. But for the next generation, for Thomas Jr. And whatever other grandchildren might be willing to break the cycle of entitlement and greed that consumed their parents. That would be a legacy worth leaving. As I write these final words, sitting in my study with the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, I find myself at peace with everything that's happened. The betrayal, the revenge, the consequences, all of it has led me to this moment, this place, this life that I built from the ashes of broken family bonds. I'm 82 years old. I've been a son, a husband, a father, a grandfather, a businessman, and now, finally, a philanthropist. I've succeeded and failed, loved and lost, trusted and been betrayed. I've made mistakes and good decisions, and I've learned that the difference between wisdom and foolishness is often just a matter of timing and perspective. If I could go back and change things, would I? Would I try harder with my children, invest more time in their character development, set better boundaries earlier? Maybe. Probably. But I can't go back, and neither can they. We all made our choices, and now we're all living with them. What I can do is move forward with intention and purpose. I can ensure that the wealth I've accumulated does real good in the world. I can support causes that matter, help families in crisis, and fund research that might save lives. I can build relationships based on genuine connection rather than financial obligation. I can choose happiness over duty, authenticity over appearance, and peace over family drama. And I can tell this story, my story, so that others might learn from my mistakes and my successes. So that other parents might recognize the warning signs of entitlement in their children before it's too late. So that other elderly people might understand that they don't owe their wealth to anyone simply because of biology. So that everyone might remember that family is about love and respect, not money and obligation. The $3 million will was a test, and my children failed it spectacularly. But in failing it, they freed me to pass a different test, the test of whether I could let go of toxic relationships and build something meaningful in their place. I passed that test. And in doing so, I finally, truly honored Margaret's memory and lived up to the values she tried so hard to instill in our family. That's my revenge, if you can call it that. Not the money I kept from my children, not the embarrassment of the courtroom revelation, not even the lesson I taught them about consequences. My revenge is living well, living purposefully, living authentically in a way that shows them every day what they gave up when they chose greed over love. They could have had a father who supported them, guided them, and eventually left them a meaningful inheritance. Instead, they have nothing but regrets and resentment. They could have been part of something bigger than themselves, part of a legacy of compassion and generosity. Instead, they're living with the shame of their exposure and the knowledge that they destroyed their relationship with their father for money they never received. And me? I have a life filled with purpose, friendships built on genuine affection, and the satisfaction of knowing that when I do finally die, for real this time, I'll leave the world a better place than I found it. That's not revenge. That's victory. And I'll take that victory to my grave, whenever that day finally comes, with a smile on my face and peace in my heart.